Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be going over how to mix your samples better. This is something that I think a lot of people don't pay attention to enough, and just like a beat, I think a good mix for your samples can take them to the next level and really help them stand out. I'm just going to go over some simple things that I do to help create a better mix when layering your sounds and just show what I do. So yeah, let's get right in the video. Alright, so I got this sample pulled up. The sample is from a sample pack that I just dropped. I'll leave a link down in the description for that. It's got 20 dark samples, good for trap and drill. But I thought that this sample was really good in terms of filling out the mix, hitting all the frequencies from the low end to the high end and not having it sound bad or like anything's clashing. So I'll go ahead and play the finished product, and then I'll go over exactly what I did, my thought process, and how I came up with this sample and made the mix better. Okay, so as you can tell, the mix in the sample is pretty good in my opinion. I think that all the frequencies from the bass, the low end, all the way to the high end are all filled out, but everything sounds really clean. So I'll go ahead and I'll mute this, and I'll go to all of these sounds that I used to make the sample. The first thing that's super important when you want to have a good mix, particularly with samples and making melodies, you want to have good sound selection. It's super important, because if you have bad sounding sounds, then it doesn't matter how much you try to mix them, they'll never sound good. So you want to have a good starting point. So what I did is I pulled up Omnisphere here, and I pulled up Keyscape, and I got this piano, simple piano, and then I also pulled up Contact and went into Session Strings 2 and grabbed this vibe, and then I got this bell from a one-shot pack, and then I also got this bass from a one-shot pack. So as you can hear, these sounds are nothing too crazy, just a piano, a string, a bell, and a bass, but they're all super clean, and I think that they fit well together. So that's something you want to put some thought into when you're making samples, is make sure that your sound selection is on point. Okay, so once you have your sound selected, obviously you want to lay out the pattern. This is a sample I already made, so obviously I already did that. I have the pattern laid out here. But in terms of getting a good mix, the next thing that you want to focus on is leveling. You want to make sure everything's leveled, just like a beat with the drums. You want to make sure everything's hitting at the right volume. So the first sound that I have here is this piano, and I have it out here in this audio file. I rendered it out from the MIDI, and then I believe, yeah, I went in here and I changed the sample rate. So this is one trick that you can do, where you go here, change the sample rate, you hit resample, and then tempo sync. You can kind of mess around with the different sample rates, but it kind of just changes the sound. It almost acts as like an EQ. It EQs out the high end and low end. So I gave it a pretty low sample rate because I wanted to take out a lot of the high ends. And then all I did was I just dragged it in here, and it sounds like this. And so I wanted that to be like the main element of the sample that just kind of sits in the middle. So I started with that. I added some separation to it. And then the next thing that I did was I grabbed the string, and this I pulled out as an audio clip as well, but I left the sample rate as is. So I wanted that to be kind of behind the piano. I didn't want it to be like too loud because I know that it's in the higher frequencies. So I put that kind of below the piano. And as you can see up here with the waveform, you can see the frequencies are pretty even. The highs aren't too high, the lows aren't too high. And the piano that's in a little bit lower frequency area is just a little bit higher than the strings. That's pretty much where I wanted that to be. And then I pulled in this bell, laid out the pattern. And I also wanted that to be around the same as these strings in terms of the volume. I wanted it to be behind the piano. I added a little bit of separation to that as well. What separation does is it kind of makes it so that, so when you put something in mono, which is the opposite of being separated, it makes it so that it's coming through the middle of the mix. it's not coming from the left and the right. It's only coming through the middle. When you separate something, it does the opposite. So it makes it so that it widens the sound and so that it's coming more out of the left and the right. Like I said, I wanted the piano kind of in the background, so I widened it out the most, and then I widened out the bell because I wanted it to kind of just be going back and forth between the left and right. So another thing that I did is I panned these two sounds in different directions. So I panned these strings to the left and then I panned the bell to the right, and that also kind of creates separation so that they have their own space in the mix. And then, like I said, I kept the piano in the middle. And then the last thing that I did is I brought in this bass. But I also didn't want the bass too loud, but I wanted the bass to be louder than everything else. So I wanted the bass to be above the piano, but just barely. So that's where I leveled that. And the final thing that I did is I added this texture just to fill out some of the very, very high ends and just give it a little bit more of a vinyl feel. That's not a huge deal. You don't have to do that, but I think that it does help with the mix a little bit. I'll go ahead and play how that sounds with all the sounds together before I rendered it out and pitched it around and everything. Okay, so for the last and final thing that you want to focus on when trying to get a good mix with your samples is effects. Now that I have my sounds selected and I made sure that I had good sounds, and then I also made sure that everything was leveled correctly, you want to go in and you want to add like EQs and reverbs and stuff like that to also help the mix. So I'll go ahead and show what I did. For the first sound, for the piano, I added an EQ to take even more of the high ends out, and also the sub frequencies, so the very low end. And then I also added some reverb. And when you add reverb, make sure you take the low end out. It's something that probably a lot of people don't know. That'll make your sounds sound less muddy with the reverb. And then I also added some RC20. And then for the strings, I added an EQ, just EQ'd out some of the high end. And the reason I EQ'd out some of the high end is because I knew when I added the bell that the bell was going to have a lot of frequencies in the very high end. So I didn't want those two things to clash. So I took out some of the high end, took out some of the low end. Another reason why I EQ'd the piano the way that I did, where I took out a lot of the high end and even some of the high middle, was because I knew that the strings and the bell were going to be like primarily in that area. So I didn't want them all to be clashing. You got to think about where the frequencies are going to be with each sound, and then EQ according to that to try to make everything fit together. So I added an EQ there, and then I added another EQ to EQ out some more of the low end, and then I half timed it 50%. And then for the bell, I EQ'd out the low end, EQ'd out some of the high mids where the strings are, and then boosted the very high end, added some reverb, and then some RC20. And then for the bass, I just left the bass as it is because I thought it sounded good. I don't think it needed anything. Sometimes I'll go in and I'll EQ out some of the high end on the bass because it just doesn't need it, and it just, you know, muddies up some of the other sounds. But I thought that it sounded good as it was, so I just kind of left it. And so yeah, in terms of effects, it's pretty much it. For the sounds themselves, on the master, I added Sketch Cassette. It's a pretty dope plugin, really simple. It's almost like it just adds more detune, and it kind of compresses the sound, makes it sound more vintage. And then I added this gross beat filter with the side chain so that it kind of like dips in and out. I thought it sounded cool. So yeah, in terms of mix, that's pretty much everything. So you want to focus on filling out all the frequencies, having good sound selection, making sure that everything's leveled correctly, and then adding effects and EQing to make everything fit. And so once I did all of that, I rendered it out as an audio file, and then I pitched it up 2 semitones. So that's pretty much it in terms of mixing your samples. It's pretty simple, and it's a lot similar to mixing your drums in a beat. You want to make sure that you have good sounds to start with. You want to make sure that you level the sounds correctly, and then you also want to make sure that you add effects, EQ, reverb, all that kind of stuff to make the sounds kind of fit together. And then you can do little things that I do, like panning the sounds left to right, adding stereo separation. Those little things will add up, and they'll make your mix a lot better. So hopefully you enjoy the video, hopefully you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next video.